Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be around the world. I am Marcus Holmes, the facilitator of the Love and Stuff community, coming to you again with another Black History Month moment. And we are excited, and I hope that you will click share and tag someone to join in these celebrations of the rich heritage and history of persons of African American and African descent that have made this country great. We celebrate and laud the sacrifices and the brilliance and the excellence of Black people. And not only this month, because we're 365 Black, but especially in this month that has been set aside for Black History Month, so that we can raise and elevate the voices of our ancestors and forefathers who have, blazed a trail for us, that we might go forward and stand in our truth, which is an excellent truth. It's a harrowing truth, but it's an excellent truth. And so that we might better embody it, we must rehearse it so that we might go forward with it and continue the oral tradition of it, that those that follow us will know the great heritage and legacy. And those that are a part of our collective and greater community will have a better appreciation for the steps, the stony roads that we have tried. And so tonight, as we continue our look at public figures, we're looking at pastors and preachers across a wonderful collective you will hear tonight from one of the staples within the Love and Stuff community, who I am proud to say is a homegrown Detroiter, no place like Detroit. He is transplanted Oklahoma. We'll let them borrow him for now, but he is Detroit down in his soul. And so we are so honored to have him here tonight to share with you, to share with us some great reflections, on some great preachers within our great African American diaspora. And listen, there are great preachers, and he is among them, but great preachers that have blazed the trail, as I said earlier, for us to come behind, or for preachers especially to come behind. And so without any further ado, while you are clicking share, I am bringing on Reverend Darren Williams. Thank you, Reverend Williams, for joining us.
Mm-hmm. Good evening. Thank you for this platform of Love and Stuff that provides such an array and a variety of different ways to be able to touch the world. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate Love and Stuff. Thanks for having me tonight.
Absolutely. And I am going to turn it over to you. I'm looking so forward to what you are sharing. Have at it, Reverend Williams. Darren Williams, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Well, as has been said, this month is the month for celebrating Black history and African American heritage. And again, for Love and Stuff to think it not robbery to be able to dedicate a focus on what our history and our heritage has been about and is becoming and will be. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful way to add African American Black history back to the respectful column of history. And I am delighted to be a part of that. Tonight will be a focus on, as have been said, African American preachers, scholars who have made a mark on not just the church world, not just religion itself, but on the world itself. In fact, if you have watched the PBS series that has aired, I think Wednesday night, maybe Tuesday night and Wednesday night this week, called The Black Church, a documentary done by Dr. Henry Louis Gates, at least three of the people that I'm going to talk about on here with us tonight were mentioned in that documentary because they have been giants and influence makers in the faith and in the history of African American people. And so we will begin, very interestingly and maybe untraditionally. I want to first talk about a preacher of the female species. There's so much talk, and even it was done on the documentary about how the church, especially African American church, has had such a difficult time with women, the question of the issue of women in ministry. I want to start tonight on this Black History Focus to talk about one of those preaching women who was not just a preacher. However, she was also a theologian. She was an ethicist. She was a civil rights activist. Prathia Hall is her name. And there's a treat for you. You can actually find a clip of her preaching on YouTube. Not too long myself came across her and her incredible ministry and incredible personage. I took a class a couple of years ago, completing a master's in theology program, a class on the Black church, and she was Black preaching. I'm sorry, excuse me. And she was actually one of the featured preachers on that. And the professor showed us a clip of her. It's actually an audio clip. Had that clip of her preaching, and it was a treat to behold. Prathia Hall is her name again. Later on, she married. Last name became Wynn. So Prathia Wynn is one of the ways that you may be able to look her up and find where and who she is. She was born into a family of preaching. Her father was actually a pastor who founded the Mount Sharon Baptist Church in Philadelphia in 1938. They were originally from Virginia, but relocated to Philadelphia, where she grew up. Her first experience with racial segregation came 1945 when she was 5 years old. She took a train from Philadelphia, her sister and her mother, back to Virginia to visit grandparents. And when they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, many of you may have never heard of what that is, but it's actually not a physical demarcation line, but it's a line between the Pennsylvania and Maryland border that separates what is considered the South in America from what is considered to be the North. It was more specifically a dividing line between what were slave states and free states. Maryland was the South, Pennsylvania at that time, then the North. But Hall later attended high school, a high school for girls there in Philadelphia, graduated in 1958 and went directly into Temple University, where she received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. While she was a student at Temple University, the early 60s, she began to participate in the civil rights movement. And on November 11th, 1961, she and 10 other demonstrators from their school, from Temple, were arrested for sitting in at a Barnes drive-in restaurant in Annapolis, Maryland. She joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which John Lewis was the president of, and Stokely Carmichael was also a member. She began working with fellow SNCC member Charles Sherwood in Southwest Georgia during the Albany movement. Her involvement continued in the civil rights movement, and she is actually credited. This is one of those little known facts, but it was discussed again in the video on the Black church, the documentary. There was a rally that they were having there in Georgia. Dr. King was, of course, there to speak. They were organizing and speaking. She was called on to pray. Prathia Hall was. And as she prayed, she started this ad lib in her prayer, and I have a dream. And she talked about what her dream was in terms of the realities of our country. And I have a dream. I have a dream. Ironically, she was the person to take Dr. King to the airport. And as she was driving him, he said to her that I like that, what you said about that dream. I'm going to use that. And you'll see in the documentary that she was actually asked about that exchange between them. And she related the story that it was her creative brainchild to talk about I Have a Dream that Dr. King popularized first in his march in Detroit in 1963, but most famously in August later that year in 1963, which the world actually knows him about. And the rest of what he filled in was his own. But the concept of I Have a Dream came from this preacher, Prathia Hall. You do yourselves well to study up on her to find out about who she is. The next preacher that I want to lift up before us is a giant of a man when it comes to the realm of theological studies and ministry altogether. When African Americans enter into seminary, it's not too long before we are introduced to the likes of this man, Dr. Howard Thurman. I had to do a book review of his a couple of weeks ago, and talked about how that before I became a preacher, I came across who he was. And it took me some years, once I did enter into ministry, to start collecting his library, because the older preachers said to us, man, if you don't have the Howard Thurman library, you ain't really no preacher. And so it was important for us as African Americans, and still is to this day, for new preachers, seminary preachers, to be able to say that they do own volumes of Howard Thurman's books. Let me just try to remember some of them. The Centering Moment is one of them. With Head and with Heart is another one of them. And then his most famous, which I did the book report on, a review rather, a couple of weeks ago, Jesus and the Disinherited. It's a fascinating book. It's one in which Thurman actually explores, as he explains, the identity of Jesus as a person. And he uses this wonderful language, this descriptor of coming from a people with their backs against the wall. And so he explains and explores Jesus as this kind of person, a disinherited person, and how in and through his identity and his ministry, those who are people with their backs against the wall, who are disinherited, how they have hope and have life and have a way in and through Jesus Christ. Thurman was born in, grew up in Daytona, Florida, raised by his grandmother, who was a former slave. And as a child, she would have him to come in and to read her the Bible. As a young child, he learned not only of the trials of slavery, but also of the slave's deep religious faith, which profoundly shaped his later vision of the transformative potential of African American Christianity. And I'm reading that from his biography, but let me kind of unwrap that so we can have a better understanding of what was being said. From what he observed as a child by watching African American believers, those who were saved, those who are Christian, who are believers in Jesus Christ, he saw how profound and he saw how deep their faith was, and how potentially powerful it was to be able to transform not just religion, but also the nation. That's what he observed about the way he saw African Americans celebrate God. He attended Florida Baptist Academy, and of course, he's a man of letters. He matriculated at Morehouse College in 1923. He spent the summer of 1922 in residence at Columbia University. He studied mysticism at Harvard College under Rufus Jones, who was a Quaker scholar. And the little bit about him as a mystic, that seems like something that may be a little out there, a little strange for us, but mysticism simply has at its heart the idea of having such a relationship with God, being in unity with God at such a level that God actually guides, directs, and leads one life because it is so close to Him and who God is. Thurman also was professor of religion and director of religious life at Morehouse and at Spelman colleges. I talked about some of his books. Deep River, I did not mention. The Negro Spirituals speaks of life and death. Two of his other books. One of the things I think was really interesting about Thurman as I learned more about him a few weeks ago. Well, and this is something that I'd heard some time ago, that he was so into, again, this idea of a mystic and being one with God. He understood that also meant to have an appreciation for and be drawn into and with nature. And it is talked about how that sometimes between classes, others were in cafeterias eating lunch or doing other things, that he would go outside, lay on the ground, and you're not ready for this, but he would watch the grass grow. And you can hear him talk about in some other places what this experience was like. And again, he's another one of the preachers that was in the documentary on the Black church. Some of the things that were said about him there. Let me mention this last thing, and then I'll move to the other two preachers in the time that I have left. That Dr. Thurman, in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he himself was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and not a distant mentor. He was one of the ones that Dr. King was very close to. And in fact, when he wrote his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, 1949, Andrew Jackson says in the documentary that Dr. King kept the book close to him. And then Andy Young described what he meant. He said that whenever we went anywhere, King packed his bag. He had his clean underwear and the clothes that he was going to wear. And Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, traveled with him everywhere he went. That was the kind of influence that Thurman had with Dr. King. And he was a practitioner of nonviolence, of course, and traveled to India and had audience with Gandhi as he was there. And one of the things that Dr. Thurman is also most noted for is that he became the pastor of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, or simply known as Fellowship Church. And what was so remarkable about this, that this was the first church, especially of its size, San Francisco, in the United States of America, in the 40s, 1943, about the time is when it was an interracial, interdenominational church in the United States of America in the early 1940s. Howard Thurman served as pastor in residence at the church there. And I recommend again to you to search his history, to look up on him, read up on him, and find out about who he is. Let me give you the third individual, religious leader that I want to talk about, and I slipped and said second, which really wasn't a slip because she's the second woman that I want to present to us in the history of African American the religious tradition that we have. A second woman that I want to highlight, and let me make this mention too, that there is a plethora of women who have been in ministry. For our ministerial group here in Tulsa, several weeks ago, I supplied a list of African American preachers to our Social Action Committee to be able to post them throughout the month for Black History Month. And what I submitted, which many would find interesting, is a list that actually had more women on it than men, because the sisters have been a part of the religious tradition of the African American church from the beginning. Sojourner Truth herself was a preacher. She's not part of what I'm talking about, so let me stay on task. I want to present to us now, this is not a person who is dead. This is a living and an active woman of God, religious leader, African American, that we can actually see, hear, and touch right now. Her name is Vashti Murphy McKenzie. She serves as the 117th elected and consecrated bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Church. Her historic election in 2000 represents the first time in over 200-year history of the African American Episcopal Church, a woman had obtained the level of episcopal office. The firsts continue, as she served as the first woman president of the Council of Bishops, chair of the General Conference Commission, and was the first woman host bishop for the 49th session of the General Conference of the AME Church in June 2012. She has her church there says more than 3,000 in attendance, and her husband serves as the supervisor, Episcopal supervisor. She is honored to serve as the presiding prelate of the 10th Episcopal District, and this goes into the all of the stratification, the way that the AME Church is set up. That she's also a presiding prelate, where she provides leadership to all of the AME churches in the entire state of Texas. She exercises ministry and administrative responsibilities for over 200 churches. This includes Paul Quinn College, a 140-year-old liberal arts historically Black college, HBCU, where she serves as the vice chairwoman. In the past 4 years, $8.5 million has been contributed from philanthropic donors to undergird the Work College program, We Over Me Farm, and a new dormitory. She is also the founder and chair of 10th Future Incorporated. It's a 501c3 nonprofit that gives scholarships to students and grants for local church and community service projects. Bishop McKenzie, please forgive me, Bishop McKenzie was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the inaugural President's Advisory Council of the White House, Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. She recently was invited to preach at the White House. She was invited to preach at the White House annual Easter prayer breakfast, again at the invitation of President Barack Obama. She's an author and she can preach. Let me just say a word about her as I switch to our last African American preacher. I heard her preach when I was in my I had to be in my teens, because this was before I had gone away to school. Dr. Frederick Sampson of the Tabernacle Baptist Church of Detroit would bring her to Detroit for revival. That is where I heard her first. I was enamored. I was awed. I was amazed to hear this woman preach as a teenager. When I was a teenager, fantastic preacher. Look her up, search her, y'all, and familiarize yourself with who she is. The last African-American preacher that I want to put focus and spotlight on is Dr. James H Cohn. And I don't have nearly enough time to actually talk about Dr. Cohn. Let me highlight a couple of things that are, I think, most critically important to know about Dr. Cohn. He is what considered to be the founder of Black liberation theology. Some of you are saying, huh? What is that? And I'm so glad you asked. Black liberation theology is a school of thought that believes that God is on the side of people who are oppressed, that God is present with, that God works in and through, and that God's ultimate plan is about the liberation of people in that condition, in that position. His seminal work was one that actually addressed this topic and flung him into national promise and importance. He wrote Black Theology and Black Power in 1969. That book shattered the theological world because from the first time an African-American person is talking about God from a Black perspective. Some of his other works, let me just mention them to you: Black Theology of Liberation, God of the Oppressed, a mammoth book. If you're going to read any, I will tell you the ones to pick up first to read. God of the Oppressed would be one. The other book, Malcolm and Martin, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or Nightmare, where he analyzes the ministries, the messages, and the lives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and how different their ministries were, but how necessary what the things that they did were for our entire struggle, that we couldn't have been in them both operating in the States of America. This other book that I'll mention about Dr. Cohn was not his last. The last book that he writes is actually his memoirs. I said I wasn't going to tell anybody, where he's talking about his own life and his trek as a minister and as a theologian, and the hostility of the academy initially against what he had done. But the book that he writes before that, in 2012, it's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. In this book, Dr. Cohn examines how the experience of Jesus, including his crucifixion, all leading up to his trial and all of those things regarding the cross, his death. He examines that in light of the experiencing of lynching that African Americans have dealt with since being here in the United States of America. And there is a suggestion that he make, a conclusion that he reaches. One of the reasons that African Americans are so crazy about Jesus is because he's just like us. What he experienced in his life is what African Americans have experienced in life in these United States. I suggest to you, sisters and brothers, this is just 4 of the great heroes and gigantic personalities that make up Black history and African American heritage, especially in our religious tradition. But there are so many more to be explored, to actually know, and for us to be able to celebrate and focus on. And I submit to you that you will be well rewarded to search out and look at some of who our scholars, our preachers, our religious leaders have been and are. God bless you and thank you tonight. And remember that Black history starts January 1 and ends December 31st every year. Well, I'm still on the air. I'm not supposed to be, but I think I need to continue until our time is up. I'll throw some other names of other preachers for us to explore. Let's spend some time to understand who Fred Shuttlesworth is. Let's remember Joseph Lowry, read his history. Read about Joseph Harrison Jackson. Interesting little piece about him. The reason that we have a progressive National Baptist Convention and the reason why there is a tradition in the African American church that says we should preach the gospel and not worry about politics is because when Harrison was running for president, many people in the National Baptist Convention, this is of course 1961-62, many people in the National Baptist Convention wanted Dr. Martin Luther King to run for president. And when Jackson saw how many people loved Dr. King, in all honesty, his jealousy caused him to pull out of the convention and pull several churches, many churches away, and start a whole new convention out of his hate for Dr. Martin Luther King. Of course, Jackson is a humongous figure in the Baptist tradition, the longest serving president of the National Baptist Convention ever, 20 years. He was president of the National Baptist Convention. But let me tell you, he could preach the horns off a billy goat. I mean, you talking about preaching. J.H. Jackson was a preacher par excellence until he's another then to be able to look back to the history, our history, Black history, to discover who we were. And then, of course, there would be from the Church of God in Christ tradition of the founder, C.H. Mason, Charles Harrison Mason, who was a towering figure also. All right. Thank you so much.
I am so excited. Thank you so much, Reverend Darren. I appreciate it. We of course, we're having you tomorrow to talk more about some of the preachers, but if you want to come back and talk some more about some of these other preachers, I'm fascinated to hear your perspective and to share with our viewing audience across, I'm always interested to hear about the origin of the Progressive National Baptist Convention and how it came to be. I think that story is harrowing in itself. And so there are many that know that history, but there are many that do not. So I think we have to have you come back and have some more discussion on that. Excellent job. Thank you so much. We're looking to see you tomorrow. We switched our time around today. For those that are viewing, it was at 6 o'clock instead of 7 o'clock today, because at 7 o'clock, we want you to join us on the Love and Stuff page for an exclusive replay of Love's Alive. We want you to be there. But we will be here tomorrow at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time to continue. I am sure that you've enjoyed Darren Williams. He is just a wealth of knowledge and a fascinating gentleman. And I hope that you will join us tomorrow as we close out this week's look at public figures with more information about preachers and pastors and bishops men and women of the clergy, we might call them, and to hear their unique and important contributions to our world and society. So, Darren, thank you so much for being with us today. And I appreciate it. And we're looking forward to seeing him tomorrow. If you've enjoyed Darren Williams, of course, you can follow him on Facebook, but you can follow him right to the Love and Stuff community and click follow. You'll see new things that are going to be coming in our community that Darren is going to be helping us lead an effort. So you want to follow him. He's a great man. And you can click share right now so that people in your circle of influence can learn a new fact today. Some of you may never have heard some of those names, or maybe you didn't know some of the details that he shared. Click share so that someone else can learn a Black History Month moment today. Thank you so much, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right.